David very much, and also like to acknowledge Graham. Where's Graham? There he is. Long-standing chair of the Surrey and Hampshire, North Hampshire branch, which is my home branch. Which is why I'm here. It only took me 15 minutes to get here. It's quite remarkable because most times it takes me a lot longer to get to the different places I talk. So it's a real pleasure to be with you all. And thank you, Saeed, also for your support for the event. And of course, Richard. It's fantastic when we do these shared and joint events. And I'm really thrilled that Charlotte Valero, chair of the IoD, is with us today as well. And you're going to be hearing from her a little bit later. I'm going to hopefully set the scene. I think I've got about 4 hours or something. No, half an hour.
25 minutes.
To talk about diversity and inclusion, why it's so important. I think we are at an extraordinary period of time, aren't we, in many, many ways, and many different things which are driving the future of work. And I've been in business a long time. I spent a lot of my professional career as a consultant working at Accenture, working with organisations all around the world during the 80s, 90s and noughties. And I can tell you I've never seen more debate about the future of work, about what we do, why we do it, how it's changing. And it's being driven by all these things. It's being driven by a lot of global and political change, and I don't have to spell that out. Extraordinary things going on which we've been very hard to predict and very hard to wrap the script about what's going to happen next. And it's not just about Brexit, it's about the growth of populism and many other things going on, and a very different political dynamic, and a different sense of what the future world might look like when we seem to be on this steady path towards globalisation, everything opening up and all the rest of it. Now we seem to be talking more about borders and tariffs and walls and goodness knows what. So you get all of that. You've got clearly a lot of economic uncertainty again. I think in the previous decades we tended to think as businesses it was all going to keep going in this direction, and now it's much harder to determine. A lot of disruption. Disruption seems to be the common byword of business in every sense, and a lot of it, of course, driven by technology. We talk a lot about digital disruption and how that's changing business models, new entrants. If you go back to Porter's 5 Forces model, I think the one that we have to worry about most are the new entrants. One we didn't even see, didn't even recognise as part of our sector, coming in and doing very, very different things, often enabled by technology. And then we've got social and demographic change, which is also huge. I mean, a lot of generational debates about Gen Y, now Gen Z. What's Gen Z called? Well, people talk about snowflake generations, they're lacking resilience, what's their belief about work? But actually these generations are coming into work and asking pretty profound questions about what we do and why we do it. What is the purpose of our organisation? And I did a lot of graduate recruiting in the 80s and the early 90s. I can tell you almost to the year when the questions that started to come from the audiences started to change. They weren't just interested in how much money they would get or whether they get a car when they became a manager or whatever. They were interested in what we did and why we did it. And these have become very profound questions now and talked about so much more. But you've got other things going on with demography. You've got ageing populations. You've got debates about 100-year lives and all these sorts of things. And of course, within social and demographic change, a lot more debate about diversity, which is what we're really here to talk about more this morning. And as I said, technological change. And that is a very heady mix. Some people describe it as almost a perfect storm of change going on, which is forcing us to go back to some really, really important principles about what we do and why we do it. I do think as part of that, it's putting much more people at the centre of the debate. It's really extraordinary when you think about over the last few decades how people seem to have got squeezed out of the equation. It's all about economic return. It was all about profit and loss. It was all about financial spreadsheets and processes, and not a lot about people. And now we're in this space of saying, you know what? I mean, somebody, I think it was the head of one of the big accounting bodies told me a few years ago, he said, there are only 2 things that you have in business. One is money, which we spend a lot of time counting, and the other is people, which we haven't understood terribly well, and all the sort of behavioural stuff and cultural stuff, which are harder things to measure, yet they are absolutely fundamental. So all these things like voice and recognition and inclusion and purpose and well-being and alignment and shared values and so on and so forth, those have become so much more part of the business debate and dialogue, and that is very exciting. And certainly for us in the HR profession, this is putting, and should be putting, what we believe as a profession front and centre into the business debate. And we need to have that voice at the highest levels of organisations say, this is what we've got to understand better, because it's profoundly important to today and to the future of our businesses. And even ideas like compassion, and I could even go as far as say people talk about love at work. which is it's the essence of humanity. And that's what I think is so exciting about this. It's about humanity, it's about putting the human back into work, and I dare say also the human back into human resources.
Yeah.
Because HR has not been terribly good at this stuff, has it? I mean, we've been so focused on things like process and stuff, we've stepped away from the idea of person and humanity. And believe me, you cannot do inclusion if you do not understand it from a human and humanity perspective. So as I said, I find this really exciting. It's driven by a lot of the changes that are going on. But I get constantly astonished, surprised, encouraged by the kinds of conversations that I have with CEOs or regulators or many others who are all talking about these kind of things and say, right, how do we understand this stuff better? Because it is fundamental. And I do think also that means that for us in our profession, and many others besides, we've got to move beyond ideas of best practice. Somebody has a manual and all we've got to do is jam that same stuff into our organisation and everything's fine. Because that's what we've been doing a lot of. And I plead guilty. As a consultant back in the 80s, 90s, and all that, a lot of the times we were going into organisations saying, here's best practice, that's what you should do. Here's what 50 other companies are doing, so why aren't you? And that's led us into things like, I don't know, performance management processes, which has always been one of my favourites, which have not been delivering what they're supposed to deliver. I mean, what is performance management for? Why do we do it? It's to improve performance, isn't it? But have we done that? Have we even really understood what performance is, particularly in more knowledge-driven businesses? And the processes that we've been implementing as part of that idea have not fundamentally improved performance. In fact, sometimes they've almost done the reverse. So the reality is we've got to move from an idea of best practice to best fit. What is your context? What's going to work in your environment? Yes, of course you can take ideas from other places, but do not imagine that somebody else has got the perfect solution. All you've got to do is just shove it in your organisation. And that's a different type of thinking. It's more challenging. It says we've got to understand the context of the business that we're in, we've got to understand its strategy and direction, and then we've got to work out what's going to work best for us and for our organisation. And it does say that we've got to be much more outcomes driven. If I go back to performance management, we were putting in processes without really understanding the outcome. We were saying, well, here's the process and I've done my job. And here's a great big manual to explain to all the managers how to do performance management. But that wasn't what really should have been about. And that we are using evidence and something else that we're very passionate about and have embedded these ideas at the heart of the new profession map for our profession. Which is to say, we've got to be much more principles-led, what do we believe in, evidence-based, what is the evidence of what we do, and outcomes-driven in terms of understanding the outcome that we're trying to achieve. And evidence is really important. Evidence comes from lots of places, not least of which is from academia. And Charlotte and I were talking earlier about business school connections. IoT is connecting a lot with business schools, so do we. And that's really important because we've got to use more evidence and research into practice. And there's been this sort of big divide between academia and business. We've been in business too much driven by the ideas of trends or best fits or whatever, best practice or whatever. And academics, for their part, have been talking a language we haven't always understood. I mean, I often use the example of, and I'm sure some academics in the room, if I go to a business executive's office, I've never seen the journal of anything on my desk. They don't read it, do it? You might see HBR if you're lucky, unopened, just for impression. But the reality is we haven't had a language which we've been talking together, and it's so important that we bring that evidence into work and we understand the impact. And it's particularly important in the world of diversity and inclusion. There's a lot of things that we're doing around diversity. You think, is that really working? Is that the right thing to be doing? Another subject which links to closely things like well-being and mental health are the interventions that we're using to support mental health in the workplace. Are they actually working? Are they evidence-based? And we have to keep challenging ourselves on that basis as well. So you got all of that, and then, as I said, understanding culture and organisations. I love this org chart. So these people have got old school, so they've got a secret resentment, they've got an affair going on. That is humanity at work. Right? That is humanity at work. Organisations cannot be understood just like their organisation charts, can they? It's about the human dynamics. And that's what culture is. And so a lot of this debate about do we understand why organisations and why people do what they do? Do we understand culture? We've been doing a lot of work with groups like the FRC, the Financial Reporting Council, on understanding culture, because the global financial crisis, in my view, it took 3 or 4 years after 2008 and the global financial crisis for people to recognise it wasn't because we didn't write enough rules. It was because we did not understand corporate cultures and behaviours. And now the debate is clearly shifted to say we have to understand culture and things like that. We have to understand what are the things that make people do what they do or make them believe what they believe. And that is a really important agenda, of course, for HR, and it is understanding all this sort of stuff. What sort of operating models work, and what are our ways in which we can run the business, and they're not all these traditional models we've had in the past. And as we look at the future, certainly our access to skills and capabilities is changing all the time. We're going to see more of these networked organisations. We're going to see more movement of people in and out. We're going to see more, despite IR35, we are going to see more contingent and contract workers, because that is how people are also choosing to work in many ways. Almost every organisation today would say they have skills shortages. And how we access those skills and where we access them from is clearly changing as well. So that leads us on to diversity and inclusion, why it's so important. And I always start these things, I don't care whether I'm talking about diversity and inclusion or well-being or corporate social responsibility or whatever. What is the business reason that drives these things? Because I also say that businesses don't tend to do things for altruistic reasons. They may do for a period of time, but they're not typically sustainable. If we cannot anchor these ideas at the heart of business strategy and understand the impact of them, they are not sustainable. And the interesting thing about diversity is we talk about it in so many different aspects now. And particularly for small business owners, as I talk to small business owners, it's almost overwhelming. I've got to think about race and gender, I've got to think of age, I've got to think about neurodiversity, different ways in which people think, I've got to think about disability, I've got to think about all these sorts of things. And you know what, if I don't think about these things, I may get myself in trouble. When I go recruiting, there are all these rules and laws, and a lot of small businesses say, that's part of my challenge. But why is it that we need to think about these things? Well, first and foremost, it is about access to skills. I mean, who in the room is not struggling to fill some of the posts or jobs that they have? I mean, it's becoming harder and harder. And it's becoming harder partly because the nature of jobs are changing as well, and the skills that we need are changing as well. People talk about a half-life of job skills now that is 5 years or less. I don't know how you measure those sorts of things, but it sort of makes a point that we are having to upskill and reskill much more. And how we find these people and access to skills is a very good reason why strategically we've got to think more diversely. It is clearly also about innovation and creativity. We all know about groupthink. We all know that if we keep recruiting people who look like ourselves and think like ourselves and been educated like ourselves, we're going to get the same outcome. I mean, you've heard a lot about Dominic Cummings and his desire to recruit weirdos and oddballs. Yeah, he made a point, although I don't know if you read his full statement, but at the bottom where he said something about you forget HR and all of that. Did you read that? Yeah, he did. And now he's beginning to reap the wind of that. So, but the reality is, he had a point. That you need to bring different people with different experiences, different ways of thinking, to break the cycle of groupthink. And we need that in government as much as we need in private sector. But you have to be careful how you do it. So, you've got the innovation and creativity point, which I think we all understand. Community and customer connection. It is incredible when you look at businesses today, and certainly in the past, how they do not represent their customer groups. Or the communities which they're part of. I remember talking to Andy Briggs, who was the head of Aviva, when he first joined Aviva, and he went to Sheffield, and they had a big call centre or operational centre up in Sheffield, and he walked from the station to the operational centre, and what did he see in terms of the community that he was part of? He saw an incredibly diverse, particularly ethnically diverse community, and when he got into the operations centre, what did he see? He didn't see that. He saw something different. He saw a much less diverse organisation. So this is also really, really important, and particularly when we talk about the future of responsible business and local connection and being part of the community, because business is part of society. It hasn't always thought about itself like that, and it hasn't always behaved like that, but responsible business profoundly is part of society and community. And that to me is another very important driver, that we need to have businesses therefore that reflect the communities that we're part of. So you've got that, and without doubt, future-proofing. Without doubt. I mean, all those things lead to future-proofing. So there's a very compelling case for it, but we still have a lot to do. Yes, we're making progress. It's fantastic to see how much more being talked about. There is more pressure from the regulatory environment and government and things like reporting on gender pay gap, and that is not going to stop. But I, for one, really do believe that whilst I'm supportive of things like gender pay gap and certain rules and some of this, most of it's going to be, needs to be driven by businesses acting responsibly. Because the interesting thing about gender pay gap is that, yes, I think you can show it's beginning to have some effect. And I know the media jumps on our backs all the time and says, well, it's no different from what it was last year. Well, everybody needs to understand it's going to take a bit longer than just 1 year. But the reality is force some attention on it. Now, the question becomes, so do you extend it to ethnicity and a lot of other characteristics of diversity? And it gets harder and harder. You get into intersectionality, you get into a lot of debates about things like, well, how do I categorize people in these different ways? And how do I do that in ways which are not, frankly, intrusive? So you get all of that sort of debate. But I don't think there's a balance to be achieved between saying, and the government is pushing on things like ethnic pay gap reporting and so forth, to say, all right, so we need some of this to prompt businesses to pay attention to it properly, but we also need businesses to step up and respond and show that they are taking it seriously. And acting, as I said before, on principles, not just rules, and a principle that we believe in inclusion. And we believe and we understand what it's about. But you know, you can read that there are lots of quotes and lots of stats about, well, how people really feel. You know, if I'm gay or if I'm ethnic, from a different ethnic background, am I really treated in the same way as everybody else? Am I treated fairly? Do I have my voice heard? Or is there inherent bias in how we work and operate as businesses? So there may be more debate in some of the breakouts and some of these things. But yeah, I think in the end, what's inclusivity? Well, inclusivity is these sorts of things when I feel part of something I value for my own unique skills and abilities. I'm treated, in other words, as an individual as well as part of a team or a collective. I can be authentic. It's incredible how many people go to work and they hide things. You can sort of see it from some of the stats previously. They hide their sexuality. They hide maybe some of their disabilities. I've done quite a lot of work with groups like the Autistic Society. They talk about masking. You know, these people get to a point where they say, in order for me to have any chance of working in this environment, I've got to mask these things. And I've got to adapt my behaviour so that I conform. Because if I don't conform, I'm not going to get on. And that is all born out of, as I said, I think a long-standing culture of businesses which has said, well, it isn't about humanity, it is about conformity. It is about getting people to do the same things and having the processes to get them to do the same things. And it's this idea, therefore, I don't always need to conform to belong. And so again, go back to Dominic Cummings, part of what he's saying. You get people who are different, they don't all have to conform. If they all conform in the same way, you end up with the same result. You end up with a group thing. But these are challenging things to do because as a business person, as a leader, isn't it so much easier when you say, well, everybody does the same thing, you all work in the same way, you all turn up at the same time, you all work the same hours, you all do what I tell you to do. But the fact is, we're not robots. That's what robots do. Humans don't tend to. But the great strength of humanity is that we are different. And that's the whole point of inclusion. And that, you know, that they do perceive their organisation to be fair. They perceive it to be fair. And if you go out and ask people, you know, from all these different backgrounds that you've got in your organisation, do they think it's fair? Do they think they're treated fairly? Or do they think that they're having to conform in some ways in order to fit a norm, in order to progress? And these are the really deep-rooted questions that we have to be asking in our organisations. And therefore, critical areas to think about. Well, employee behaviour, I mean, the reality is inclusion is something we all have to think about. Not just me as a leader or the line managers. Yes, of course, they have a critical role. But this is something we all have to understand. And as I said, humanity is an interesting thing. I mean, if you go back to our own sort of, you know, how our brains are wired, we see difference typically as a threat. You go back to when we all ran around, if we read things like Sapiens, we were all running around the place of Africa or where it was. That was how our brains were wired. You know, we look at people like ourselves and say, yeah, that's likely to be a friend. We look at people who are different and say, no, that's likely to be a threat. And we have to understand that as part of our inherent bias that creates some of the challenges that we see. So we have to understand for everybody, this is everybody's responsibility. And we've all got a responsibility to treat people fairly and face value and all these other ideas. Clearly, we've got to build line manager skills and capabilities. I mean, it's a remarkable fact, isn't it? When we think about what have we done in the last 20 or 30 years in terms of training line managers to be good people managers? And the answer in most cases is very little. We promoted them because they're technically competent. We promote the best salesperson to be the sales manager, the best computer programmer to be the computer program lead. And then we say, right, now get on and manage. Well, the reality is all the trends of work I've described is making that job harder and harder. You can't just say, go manage when you've got a diverse team. And I mean diverse in every sense, including the fact that people are working part-time and working flexibly. Now guess which, did you notice on the GPG? gender pay gap, there was a negative variance for part-time workers. Now, why is that? Huh? Because they're mainly women. And what is our natural bias towards people working part-time? How do we evaluate somebody who's working full-time as in my face, 9 to 5, probably there actually before I arrive and there after I've gone just to prove how hard they're working, than somebody who's working part-time? What's our natural bias? No, they're not committed. Oh, they're working from home. Yeah? And all that kind of stuff. So these are really, really important things. We have to teach our managers, and we have to hold them accountable. It's not just that, yeah, great job, you knocked the ball out of the park with your sales, but did you manage your team effectively? Did you make it inclusive? Did you get the best out of all of them, no matter who they were or how they were? And evaluate them on those things as well. Clearly senior commitment to inclusion, there's no doubt about that. You've got to have business leaders, and you've got to have a business leadership that not only physically represents diversity, but speaks the language and understands it, and understands why it's important to the organisation. And not just at a surface level. Which is why all this debate about, okay, is your senior leadership team diverse? You know, the Stevens Alexander and all these reviews that have been done on have I got diversity in my top teams. Not just at the board, but coming down to the organisation. And that is the most visible commitment of all, my dear. Is that you've got senior leadership that is diverse and is speaking that language. Policies and people management practice quite clearly, I'll talk a little bit more about one or two of those, I've already touched on some of them. And organisational values, climate and culture. Because no matter what practices we put in place, if the climate, the culture, and people aren't behaving in the right ways, you won't succeed. You can, I mean, it's scary sometimes when you look at the stats of people who are trying to recruit into their organisation. People are very different, from very much more diverse backgrounds than the norm. And then you look at how long they stay. I think one of the most important stats is when we're doing recruitment, particularly at these mid and senior levels, is how long do people stay? Not that you filled the job, but did they stay? And if they didn't stay, then why was it? Well, typically, people join organisations where they leave managers and all that kind of debate, right? So we need to understand this stuff at that sort of level. So issues to address. You know, I've touched on most of this already, but first of all is the buy-in commitment. And as I said, what is the business case? Why are we doing this? It's not just because we're trying to be politically correct, although it is politically correct. We're not just trying to be woke and all of that. We're trying to do it because it's important to our business. And if we don't understand that, as I said before, then I'm not sure these things are sustainable. So that sort of business case and visible leadership from the top is the starting point. We've then got to understand, of course, as I said, the organisational context. There's not one certain manual you can take off the wall and say, that's what exactly I've got to do. But how does my organisation work, locally, nationally, internationally? Is it one big sort of global enterprise where I can just have standard policies and everybody does the same thing? Well, maybe, but even if you've got that, you've still got to recognise the issues of diversity are different in different places. And when I go to, even within the United Kingdom, when I go to places like Scotland, there's obviously less ethnic diversity there. I look around this room, there's not a lot of ethnic diversity. Now, is that our fault, or is that also part of the community? I mean, the reality is, you know, North Surrey, Guildford is not a terribly ethnically diverse part of the country, is it? And yet, as I made an example before, if I go to Sheffield, it's very different. So we've got to understand that local context as well. We've got to understand our organisational operating model. Sometimes you can implement these things with lots of central practice, and that's how the culture works, and sometimes it is not. It's very local, and it's about what you do locally. And what are the key pressures to the organisation? Again, one of the things going to be driving right down to recruiting managers as to why this is important to do. Is it skills shortages? Is it about creating more innovation in the organisation and so on? The people data, again I touched on, also so important. If we do not understand what the diversity of our organisation is now, then it's very hard to build from it. Now, GPG is an interesting example. I talked to many HR leaders, very senior HR people, who were getting a bit of a fluster when we first introduced gender pay gap. I said, that's very complicated, very different. I said, well, why weren't you doing it already? Why did you not understand this already? And I don't care what metrics they use, how to do quartiles or whatever. We needed to understand this, and we weren't on it. So gender pay gap, as I said, I think it has prompted a lot more of this debate. But it gets harder, doesn't it? I talked about ethnicity. Another big debate going on, socioeconomic diversity. And how do I measure that? We're doing a lot of work with organisations like the civil service. And the civil service, from the very top, John Manton, Chief Executive, on down, has said the civil service needs to be the most diverse organisation in the country. Now, why would that be? Well, it's because the civil service represents us all. And when I made the point about organisations representing their customer base, that must be true of the civil service. But the question that we've been working on with them is, how do you measure this and understand it across all these protected characteristics? And it gets harder. As I said, when you look at things like socio-economic status, how do you measure that effectively? If you go to the ONS way of measuring it, they've got something like 14 questions, most of which, many people, if you just trotted out those questions, would find quite offensive. Or I'd certainly ask the question, why ask me now? Why you ask me questions like, did I have free, I'm 40 years old, and you ask me questions like, did I have free school meals when I was 14? Or what my parents did? And you have to be really sensitive about how you ask these questions. You've got to explain why and what you're going to do with it. Because this is another of the, we talk so much about data, about people, analytics and all those things, but oh my goodness, must we be transparent about why? What are you collecting that information for, and what are you going to do with it? And if you did understand my socioeconomic status, what does that mean? What are you going to do with that? Do I now get extra preferential treatment to get promoted or not? What does it mean? So we're going to be very transparent about why we're collecting it. We're very sensitive about how we collect it. And that may be one of the debates amongst tables and things, but it's a very important point, and we do need the evidence, and we do need the data, but we've got to think carefully about how we get it. Then you get things like recruitment and progression. This person fit versus diversity. Don't you think in recruitment we so often use this language, say, well, we need to make sure these people fit our values and culture. Well, that can be code, but not a very transparent code, but yeah, I want people to look like me. And I remember a guy called Rennie Carriol, who you may have come across many years ago when I was still at Accenture back in the 90s. We were talking about some of this stuff, and he said to me, when was the last time you recruited somebody truly scary? I've never forgotten that, because it just landed in my head. It's going back to my point about how our brains are wired. So it's completely different from me. Well, you're instantly, that's how your amygdala, your emotional responses, and you have to get past that. So it is this language is self-used that I'm going to make sure I've got a cultural fit. And what we're often saying is, yes, I'm going to reject people who aren't like me. Don't fit the corporate norm. And we have got to understand that and work on those cultural values and norms. Say, yes, but that's going to be inclusive. And if it's not, I'm going to achieve my objective. And these are deep things to understand about the behaviour and the culture of the organisation. And then, this whole debate about positive action. Should I positively promote people? Should I promote more women because I haven't got enough women in the senior ranks? And if I do that, how do I do it? And I've talked to years about, one of the scariest things I've ever done is I was asked to be the executive sponsor for the Women's Network at Accenture. And I remember going to my first event, there were 500 women in the room and me. And that, it's an interesting experience when you go into places where, because I'm used to being as a white middle-aged male in the norm, and then suddenly find you're not. But what the women were talking about was a lot of this sort of stuff. Now, how do you get the organisation to work in a way that I don't feel like being promoted just because I'm a woman, or have the men thinking that is the case? And we have to understand things like mentoring and sponsoring and support. Because I'll tell you another thing, just when I'm talking about the gender balance thing. And there's been a lot more recent debate about this. Is women don't tend to ask in the same way that men do. They don't tend to ask. And so a simple example I've often used is if there are 10 characteristics that you have to, boxes you've got to tick for the next promotion. Men will tend to say, well, I know I can do 4, I'm pretty good at the next 3 or 4, and I'll blag the rest. Women are saying, well, unless I can tick 9 out of 10, I'm not sure I should really put it. And these are generalisations, but I'm not sure I put myself forward. So actually, yes, some forms of mentoring and sponsoring to promote and support women and to encourage them to put themselves forward is important. And it's true of ethnic groups, and it's true of many other diverse groups as well. So I'm a real fan of things like sponsorship and mentorship. Now, whether we should use targets is another debate. And of course, we are being encouraged to have targets. Organisations are being encouraged to say, well, I'm going to have 50-50 women or whatever it is by X date. And that's for you to decide. I said there isn't one manual that decides all of this stuff. I think in some environments and contexts that works. And others it will be much more challenging. And there's also the debate about should we have quotas. And I've done a lot of work with people like Vicky Price, the economist, who's a strong advocate of the idea we should have quotas, for talking particularly about gender, but also about ethnicity. Because she believes, as many do, if you really, really want to change things, you're going to have to put a lot more pressure into the system. And there's people in government who think similar things as well. So the regulators also talking about some of these ideas. So that's a sort of quick run around of some of the dimensions and areas. Just wanted to touch on a couple of final points. I think underlying all of this, so we can talk about all these different characteristics, we have to be really, really careful, particularly when we're talking about diversity and inclusion and teaching managers about it. We don't say, well, this is how black people are, this is how Indian people are, this is how women are, this is how young people are, this is how people are with disabilities, and make it all look like that. The language has shifted from diversity and inclusion to the idea of inclusion. Inclusion, not just diversity. But of course it's bringing all these different groups and people together. But it's about inclusion. And then it says, okay, so what are some of the practices that are inclusive? And one of the ones that I'm very passionate about, and I've been co-chairing a flexible working task force of government on this, is flexible working. And I, for one, believe that the future will be flexible. And it's interesting, I don't even know, that John Maynard Keynes, the great British economist, almost 100 years ago said, by now, he thought we'd be working 15-hour weeks. I don't know about you, but most of us seem to be working 15 hours a day. So what the hell's going wrong? Why are we not doing this? And there's lots of reasons. You know, we've all been growing in productivity and all these other things. But there's also a huge amount of cultural stuff. I don't know if many of you work in financial services as an example. But, oh my God, I mean, why do they work in the ways they do? I got friends of my daughters who working in things like investment banks and barely get any sleep at all. You know, why do we do that? Why is it that we have a culture that demands that of young people and expects them to be productive, or even expects them to stay? Why would you do that? Okay, when I grew up and went into business, that seemed to be the norm, so you just had to work what you had to work. But, it talks about demographic change. Young people just don't accept this stuff anymore. They don't say, well, that's how it's got to be, so that's what I'm going to do. They say, well, why? That's why they're called Generation Letter Y. They're all Generation WHY. And why not? So, yes, I think this is a really important thing, but we have to understand a lot of cultural dynamics and many other things that we've already touched on. And then ultimately, I think, one of the most important outcomes for the future work is well-being. It's so profound and it's so important, and we haven't paid enough attention to it. And interestingly, just a little bit of history for CIPD. Some of you probably know this, that the history of the CIPD started just over 100 years ago. And they were the Welfare Workers Association. And they worked in some of these businesses like Roundtree's and Cadbury's and Lever Brothers, which are still around today, incidentally. And they did what it said on the tin. And as I said, I think we've gone through a long cycle of squeezing the human out and saying it's about numbers, it's about people as assets, and we've used that language, people as resources, and now we're talking about humanity at work. And I think there's nothing more human than understanding well-being. Is this job good for me? Is it good for my physical, emotional, mental health? So much more debate about mental health. And diversity is a big driver of that. If I'm in an environment I have to mask, I have to pretend that I'm not the person that I am, or I have to work and I'm under all these intense extra pressures just because of who I am, then that is not going to help with my well-being. So I'm going to leave it there because, as I said, I think this ultimately is one of the real goals for the next decade, is we've got to create work that is good for people. All the debate about good work, if you've seen that, is a big agenda for us in our profession. Because I think in HR, we have got to focus on these ideas as critical outcomes of what we do. So I'm going to leave it there, and thank you very much. I think I'm sure we'll get into some of the things.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you.